The first thing Sarah noticed about apartment 4B wasn't the peeling wallpaper or the musty smell that clung to everything like a forgotten memory. It wasn't even the way the floorboards groaned under her feet, as if the building itself was protesting her presence. No, the first thing Sarah noticed was the silence from the apartment directly across the courtyard, and the small, pale face pressed against its third-floor window. "Careful with that one," David called out, his voice echoing through the empty rooms as the movers struggled with their belongings. "Sarah's books weigh more than our couch." She tried to smile at his joke, but her eyes kept drifting back to that window. A child couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, with dark hair that seemed to absorb the afternoon light. Even from this distance, she could see those eyes, wide, unblinking, staring directly at her. "Hey," David's hand found her shoulder, warm and reassuring. Earth to Sarah. "What's got you so?" He followed her gaze across the courtyard and squinted. "What are you looking at?" "That child." "In the window there?" She pointed, but when they both looked, the window was empty. Nothing but yellowed curtains swaying slightly, though there was no breeze. David shrugged. "Probably just curious about the new neighbors. I remember doing the same thing when I was a kid." But as the afternoon wore on and the movers finished their work, Sarah found herself checking that window again and again. Each time, the child was there. Each time, those dark eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. It was nearly 7 when Mrs. Chun from apartment 4 knocked on their door. She was a small woman, maybe 70, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and worry lines etched deep around her eyes. "I brought you some tea," she said, holding out a thermos with shaking hands. "Green tea with jasmine. Good for settling into a new place." "That's very kind of you," Sarah said, accepting the warm thermos. "I'm Sarah, and this is my husband David." Mrs. Chun nodded, but her smile was strained. She glanced nervously toward the window, the same window Sarah had been watching all day. "I wanted to welcome you properly," Mrs. Chun continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "and to give you some advice about living here." David raised an eyebrow. "Advice?" The old woman wrung her hands. "This building, it has its peculiarities, things you need to know to be safe." "What kind of things?" Sarah asked, though something cold was already settling in her stomach. Mrs. Chun stepped closer, her voice becoming urgent. "If you see a child at the window across the courtyard, you must never wave back. You must never acknowledge it. You must never, under any circumstances, make eye contact for more than a few seconds." The thermos nearly slipped from Sarah's hands. "What child?" "The one you've been watching all afternoon." Mrs. Chun's eyes were deadly serious. "I saw you looking." Many new tenants do the same thing. They see the child and think it's sweet, innocent. But it's not. David laughed nervously. "Come on, Mrs. Chun. It's just some kid who lives across the way." "No." The word was sharp, final. "No child lives in that apartment. That apartment has been empty for 3 years. Ever since." She trailed off, shaking her head. "Ever since what?" Sarah pressed. Mrs. Chun looked toward the window one more time, then back at them with eyes full of regret and fear. "Ever since the last family waved back." "What happened to them?" David's voice had lost its skeptical edge. "They disappeared." Mrs. Chun's words hung in the air like smoke. "All 3 of them, father, mother, and their little girl. The police found no signs of struggle, No indication of where they went. They were simply gone. The only thing left behind was their daughter's bedroom window, still open, still waiting. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. How long ago did you say this was? 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Mrs. Chun's precision was chilling. I've been counting. And the child in the window? Mrs. Chun's silence was answer enough. After Mrs. Chun left, Sarah and David sat in their new living room, surrounded by boxes, neither speaking. The jasmine tea had grown cold between Sarah's hands. "She's just a lonely old woman," David finally said. "Probably makes up stories to feel important." But even as he said it, his eyes drifted to the window across the courtyard. It was dark now, the apartment building across from them lit only by the occasional window. But that third-floor window, the one Mrs. Chun had warned them about, glowed with a soft, sickly light that seemed to come from nowhere. And there, pressed against the glass, was the child. "David," Sarah whispered. "Look." This time he saw it too. The small figure, unnaturally still, watching them with those dark, bottomless eyes. The child's hand was pressed against the glass, and even from their distance, he could see the condensation from its breath, fogging the window. "Jesus," David breathed. "How is it so clear? We're at least 50 feet away." As if responding to his voice, the child lifted its other hand and began to wave. Slow, deliberate movements, back and forth, back and forth. Sarah found herself lifting her own hand almost involuntarily. "Don't." David caught her wrist, his grip tight enough to bruise. "Remember what Mrs. Chun said. But it's just a child." "No." His voice was firm, frightened. "Look at it. Really look at it." Sarah forced herself to focus on the figure in the window, and her blood turned to ice. The child's movements were too fluid, too perfect. No living child stood that still, breathed that little. And those eyes, they never blinked, never looked away. The waving continued for another minute before the child simply stopped. Its hand remained raised for a moment longer, then slowly pressed back against the glass. The figure stood there for another few seconds, then dissolved into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. That first night, Sarah dreamed of windows. She dreamed of standing in an endless hallway lined with glass, each pane reflecting not her own face, but the face of the child. In the dream, she could hear something calling her name over and over, the voice getting closer with each repetition. She woke with a gasp, her nightgown soaked with sweat. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m. Beside her, David slept peacefully, one arm thrown over his eyes. Sarah lay still for a moment, listening to his steady breathing and trying to convince herself it was just a nightmare. Then she heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the living room window. Sarah slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cold hardwood floor. She crept to the bedroom doorway and peered into the living room. The tapping continued, soft but insistent. Tap, tap. She knew she shouldn't look. Every instinct screamed at her to go back to bed, to wake David, to call someone, anyone. But something stronger than fear pulled her forward, step by careful step, until she stood before the window. The child was there, closer than before, as if it had somehow crossed the impossible distance of the courtyard. Its small fist knocked against the glass with mechanical precision, never varying in rhythm or intensity. Tap, tap, tap. Up close, Sarah could see details that made her stomach lurch. The child's skin had a grayish pallor, like old newspaper. Its clothes, a simple white nightgown, seemed to flutter despite there being no wind. And its eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire eye, like looking into two deep wells at midnight. The child stopped tapping and pressed both palms against the glass. When it spoke, its voice somehow carried through the window as if there were no barrier at all. "Please," it whispered. "I'm so cold, so lonely. Won't you let me in?" Sarah's hand moved toward the window latch without her permission. "Sarah." David's voice cracked like a whip from behind her. "Step away from the window." The spell broke. Sarah jerked her hand back, stumbling away from the glass. When she looked again, the child was gone, but the condensation from its breath remained on the window. 2 small handprints and the fog from a mouth that should have been breathing. "What were you doing?" David pulled her away from the window, his face pale with terror. I don't know. I heard tapping, and when I looked..." She gestured helplessly toward the window. David grabbed a chair and shoved it against the window and pulled the curtains closed. "We're not opening these again. Not ever." But even with the curtains drawn, they could feel it watching. The next morning brought no relief. If anything, the daylight made everything worse, because now they could see other signs of the child's presence. Small handprints appeared on windows throughout the building. Not just theirs, but others too. Mrs. Chun's window bore the marks, as did the windows of the young couple in apartment 3B, and the elderly man who lived alone on the first floor. But it was Sarah and David's window that bore the most marks. Dozens of tiny handprints, as if the child had spent the entire night pressed against the glass. "We should call the police," David said over breakfast, though his voice lacked conviction. "And tell them what? That a dead child is trying to get into our apartment?" Sarah pushed her eggs around her plate, unable to eat. "They'll think we're crazy. Maybe we are crazy. Maybe this whole thing is some kind of shared hallucination brought on by stress from moving." But even as he said it, they both knew it wasn't true. Mrs. Chun's knock was tentative, almost apologetic. When David opened the door, she was holding a small canvas bag that smelled of sage and something else, something older and more complex. "I brought you some things," she said, not waiting for an invitation before stepping inside. "Protections. They won't stop it, but they might buy you some time." "Time for what?" Sarah asked, "to figure out what it wants from you specifically." Mrs. Chun began pulling items from her bag, bundles of dried herbs, small mirrors, and what looked like old photographs. "This thing, it doesn't appear to just anyone. It chooses its targets carefully." She handed Sarah one of the photographs. It showed a family, mother, father, and a little girl with dark hair and bright, living eyes. The same eyes that now stared at them from the window, but empty of all warmth and life. "The Morrison family," Mrs. Chun explained. "They lived in your apartment before you. Before them, it was the Herreras. Before them, the Kowalskis. 7 families in 15 years, all gone." David studied another photograph. "What happened to the child? The real child?" Mrs. Chun's face crumpled with grief. Emma Morrison was 8 years old. She fell from that 3rd-floor window 3 years ago. Her parents said she'd been acting strange for weeks before it happened, talking to someone who wasn't there, standing at her window for hours at a time, claiming she had a friend who wanted to play. Sarah felt sick, and after she died, the other children started appearing. Children who had died in this building over the decades. accidents, illnesses, things that happen in old places. But Emma, she was different, stronger. She became their leader, I suppose, their voice. Mrs. Chun began placing the mirrors around the apartment, angling them toward the windows. These will help confuse them, make it harder for them to focus on you. The herbs will mask your scent. They track by smell as much as sight. Our scent? David's voice climbed higher. The scent of the living. It draws them. Mrs. Chun worked methodically, her movements practiced. But there's something else, something I haven't told you. Sarah and David exchanged glances. What? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. They don't just want to be acknowledged. They want to trade places. Mrs. Chun's words fell like stones into still water. A life for a life. That's why the families disappear. The children take them, and in return, the families become the watchers at the windows. The explanation hung in the air like a toxic fog. Sarah found herself unconsciously rubbing her wrists where David had grabbed her the night before. So what do we do? David asked. How do we make it stop? Mrs. Chun paused in her work. I don't know if you can. Every family thinks they're different, thinks they can resist. But the children are patient. They have all the time in the world. And we get tired. We make mistakes. She finished positioning the last mirror and turned to face them. The longest anyone has lasted is 6 months. The Kowalskis. They were very strong, very determined. But in the end, they waved back, Sarah finished. Mrs. Chun nodded grimly. That evening, they tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. David attempted to cook dinner while Sarah unpacked books, both of them carefully avoiding the windows. The mirrors Mrs. Chun had placed caught the light strangely, creating fragments of reflected images that danced across the walls. It was Sarah who noticed it first. A slight change in the quality of light coming through the curtains. David, she said quietly, I think it's back. He turned off the stove and joined her in the living room. Even through the heavy curtains, they could see the glow from across the courtyard. That sickly, unnatural light that seemed to emanate from the abandoned apartment. Maybe if we ignore it completely, it will go away, David suggested, but his voice shook with uncertainty. They tried. They ate dinner in the kitchen, played cards at the small table, even attempted to watch a movie on David's laptop. But the presence across the courtyard pressed against their consciousness like a physical weight. At 11:30 p.m., the whispering started. At first, it was so soft they weren't sure they were hearing it at all. Just a susurrus of sound that could have been wind through the building's old bones. But gradually, it became clearer. Children's voices, dozens of them, all calling the same names over and over. Sarah, David, Sarah, David. The voices came from everywhere and nowhere, through the walls, through the floors, through the very air they breathed. Sarah pressed her hands to her ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside her head. Make it stop, she whispered. David pulled her close, his own face gray with terror. It's just sound. It can't hurt us. It's just sound. But even as he said it, they both knew he was wrong. The voices were getting closer, more insistent, and with them came other sounds. Footsteps in empty rooms, doors opening and closing, the soft scratch of fingernails against glass. The whispers continued for 3 hours. When they finally stopped, at exactly 2:47 a.m., the silence was somehow worse than the noise had been. Sarah and David sat huddled together on their couch, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. "Tomorrow," David said finally. "Tomorrow we're leaving. We'll find another apartment, another city if we have to." Sarah nodded, but deep down, she wondered if it would be that simple. The way Mrs. Chun had described it, the way those black eyes had seemed to look right through her, she had the terrible feeling that distance wouldn't matter. The next morning, they began packing with desperate efficiency. Sarah called in sick to work, while David made arrangements with the moving company. They would be out by evening, they decided. Whatever deposit they lost on the apartment was a small price to pay for their sanity, and possibly their lives. But as the day wore on, strange things began to happen. The moving company called back to say their truck had broken down, and they wouldn't be able to come until next week. David's boss called with a family emergency that required David to work late. Sarah's mother called, crying, claiming she'd had a nightmare about Sarah and begging her not to leave the apartment. By afternoon, it became clear that something was actively working against their escape. "It's manipulating things," Sarah said, staring at her phone after the fourth cancellation call. "Somehow, it's keeping us here." David paced the living room like a caged animal. "That's impossible. It's just a string of bad luck." But even he didn't sound convinced. As evening approached, their situation became increasingly desperate. Every avenue of escape seemed to close just as they reached for it. Rental cars were suddenly unavailable. The train station had computer problems that prevented ticket sales. Even calling a taxi resulted in drivers who never showed up or claimed they couldn't find the address. "We're trapped," Sarah said as the sun began to set. "It won't let us leave." David slumped against the wall, defeated. "So what do we do? Just wait here until we go crazy?" Before Sarah could answer, Mrs. Chun's voice called through their door. "Sarah, David, you need to come quickly." They found her standing in the hallway, her face pale with terror. She pointed toward the window at the end of the hall, the window that looked out over the courtyard. Every window in the building across from them was now glowing with that same sickly light. And in each window stood a child, some young, some older, all with those same black, bottomless eyes. But it was the window on the third floor that made Sarah's blood freeze. Emma Morrison was no longer alone. Standing beside her were three figures Sarah recognized from Mrs. Chun's photographs. The Morrison parents, their faces gray and lifeless, their eyes as empty as their daughters. "They're all here now," Mrs. Chun whispered. "Every family that ever disappeared. They're all waiting." As if responding to Mrs. Chun's words, all the figures in the windows began to wave. Slow, synchronized movements that created a hypnotic rhythm. And this time, the compulsion to wave back was almost overwhelming. Sarah felt her hand beginning to rise against her will. "Fight it," David grabbed her arm. "Don't look at them. Don't." His words cut off abruptly. Sarah turned to see that he was staring directly at the windows, his own hand slowly rising to return their greeting. "David, no." But it was too late. His hand completed its upward arc and began to wave. The moment his hand moved in response, every figure in every window smiled. What happened next was impossible to describe in words that made sense. The world seemed to fold in on itself. Distances became meaningless. And suddenly Sarah found herself not in the hallway of her building, but standing in the abandoned apartment across the courtyard. The room was exactly as the Morrison family had left it 3 years ago, but covered in dust and decay. Children's toys lay scattered on the floor, their colors faded to gray. Family photos hung on the walls, but the faces in them had been scratched out with something sharp. And everywhere, written on the walls in what looked like dried blood, was the same message repeated over and over. Join us, join us, join us. Sarah? David's voice came from somewhere behind her, confused and distant. She turned to find him standing by the window, the same window where Emma Morrison had spent her final days. But now, instead of looking out at their building, he was looking in at it. David, we need to get out of here. But even as she said it, she realized the horrible truth. Through the window, she could see their own apartment, could see Mrs. Chun standing in the hallway, looking up at them with an expression of infinite sadness. They were on the wrong side of the glass. I can see our place, David said, his voice dreamy and distant. It looks so warm and bright from here. Sarah joined him at the window, and her heart stopped. In their apartment, moving around with familiar gestures, were two figures that looked exactly like them. The other Sarah was unpacking books, while the other David cooked dinner, just as they had done the night before. Who are they? Sarah whispered. Emma Morrison's voice came from directly behind them, though neither had heard her approach. They're you, the child said simply. The you that stays behind. The you that gets to keep living. Sarah spun around to face the little girl who had haunted their nights. Up close, Emma looked even more terrifying. Her skin was translucent, showing dark veins beneath, and her white nightgown was stained with something that might have been soil or blood. What do you want from us? Sarah demanded. Emma tilted her head, a gesture that might have been cute in a living child, but was profoundly disturbing in this hollow shell. We want what everyone wants, to not be alone, to have friends to play with. But we're not children. You will be. Emma smiled, and her teeth were too sharp, too numerous. Time works differently here. Soon, you'll be just like us. As if summoned by Emma's words, other children began to emerge from the shadows of the apartment. Sarah recognized some of them from the photographs Mrs. Chun had shown them. Children who had died in the building over the decades, all now part of Emma's ghostly congregation. The Herreras are here too, Emma said, gesturing to a corner where two adults stood with their arms around each other, their faces bearing the same empty expression as the Morrison parents. And the Kowalskis, and the Tanaka family, and all the others. We're like one big happy family now. David tried to move toward the door, but found his feet wouldn't obey him. How do we get back? You don't, Emma said matter-of-factly. This is your home now, forever and ever. She skipped to the window and pressed her small hands against the glass. But don't worry. Soon there will be new people in your old apartment, new friends to play with. It's what we do. We keep the cycle going. Through the window, Sarah could see Mrs. Chun in the hallway of their building, talking to someone out of view. A moment later, a young couple appeared, the woman pregnant, the man carrying a suitcase. New tenants, Emma sang gleefully. They're moving into your apartment tomorrow. Won't that be fun? Sarah watched in horror as the new couple entered their former home, as her doppelganger welcomed them with the same smile she had given Mrs. Chun just days before. The cycle was beginning again, and she was powerless to stop it. Please, she begged Emma, let us go. We'll do anything. Emma considered this with the serious expression that only children could manage. Anything? Yes. Will you stay and play with us forever? Sarah opened her mouth to say no, to refuse, to fight, but then she caught sight of David's face. He was changing, she realized. The color was draining from his skin. His eyes were becoming darker, and his expression was growing more distant with each passing moment. The same thing was happening to her. She could feel her memories becoming fuzzy, her connection to the living world growing thinner. Soon, she would be just another ghost in Emma's collection. "I can feel myself disappearing," David whispered. Sarah took his hand, and his skin was cold as winter. "I know. Me too." Emma clapped her hands together delightedly. "Oh, this is the best part. Soon you won't remember being sad at all. You'll only remember the fun we have together." But Sarah wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "Emma, what if I could bring you more friends?" "Better friends?" The ghostly child paused, intrigued. "What kind of friends?" Sarah's mind raced, looking for any advantage, any way to delay the inevitable transformation. Living friends. A whole building full of them. Wouldn't that be better than just 2 more ghosts? Emma's black eyes lit up with interest. "Tell me more." "There's an apartment complex across town. Dozens of families with children. If you let us go, we could bring them here. All of them." It was a lie, of course. Sarah would never condemn innocent families to this fate. But she needed time to think, needed to find some weakness in Emma's power. Emma seemed to consider this offer seriously. "But how do I know you'll keep your promise? How do I know you won't just run away?" "Because," Sarah said, grasping at straws, "you'll always be able to find us. Won't you? We've seen you now. We're connected." This seemed to resonate with Emma. She nodded slowly. "That's true. Once you've been here, you can never really leave." "Not completely. So you'll let us go?" David asked, hope creeping into his voice. "For now," Emma agreed. "But you have 1 week to bring me new friends. If you don't..." She didn't need to finish the threat. The world folded again. That same impossible sensation of distances collapsing. And suddenly Sarah and David were back in their own apartment. They were solid again, warm again. But something fundamental had changed. They could feel Emma's presence like a constant weight on their souls. Mrs. Chun was waiting for them, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I tried to stop him from waving, but it was too late." "It's not your fault," Sarah said, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears, more distant, less connected to her body. "What happened over there?" Mrs. Chun asked. David and Sarah exchanged glances. How could they explain the impossible? How could they describe being dead and alive at the same time? "We made a deal," David said finally. "We have 1 week." The week that followed was a nightmare of desperation and moral agony. Sarah and David tried everything they could think of to break free from Emma's influence, but nothing worked. They consulted priests, mediums, paranormal investigators, anyone who might have answers. But with each passing day, they could feel themselves growing weaker, more detached from the world of the living. The connection Emma had forged was like a psychic umbilical cord, slowly draining their life force. Worse still, they began to see Emma everywhere. Reflections in store windows, faces in crowds, shadows that moved independently of their owners. She was watching them, making sure they didn't try to escape. On the 4th day, David made a terrible suggestion. "What if we actually did it?" He said over breakfast, his voice hollow. "What if we found someone else to take our place?" Sarah stared at him in horror. "You can't be serious. Think about it logically. We're going to die anyway, or become like them. At least this way, we'd be saving ourselves." by condemning innocent people, by making a choice. David's eyes had dark circles under them, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor. I don't want to spend eternity as Emma's plaything. The fight that followed was vicious and heartbreaking. Sarah accused David of cowardice. He accused her of naive idealism. They said things that couldn't be taken back, revealed fears and resentments that had lurked beneath the surface of their marriage. But in the end, they both knew there was really only one choice they could live with. On the seventh day, as the sun began to set and their time ran out, Sarah and David sat together in their living room and waited. "I love you," Sarah said, taking David's hand. "Whatever happens next, I want you to know that." "I love you too," he replied. "And I'm sorry for what I said, for what I suggested. I was just scared." We both were. Emma appeared at exactly 8 p.m., materializing in their living room as if she had always been there. She looked around expectantly. "Where are my new friends?" she asked. Sarah and David stood together, holding hands. "There aren't any," Sarah said. "We couldn't do it." Emma's expression darkened. "But you promised." "We lied." For a moment, the ghostly child looked genuinely hurt, and Sarah almost felt sorry for her. But then Emma's face twisted into something far less human. "Then you'll have to come back with me. Forever this time." "We know," David said quietly. Emma studied them for a long moment, as if trying to understand their choice. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why didn't you save yourselves?" Sarah thought about it. "Because some things are worse than dying. And living with what we'd done to innocent people would have been one of them." Emma raised her hand, and Sarah felt that familiar pulling sensation, the world beginning to fold. But this time, something was different. This time, she wasn't afraid. As the apartment began to fade around them, Mrs. Chun appeared in the doorway. But she wasn't alone. Standing beside her were the translucent figures of other former tenants, people who had lived in the building over the years and died natural deaths. "Emma," Mrs. Chun said, her voice carrying an authority Sarah had never heard before. "That's enough." The pulling sensation stopped abruptly. Emma spun around to face the elderly woman, her black eyes widening. "You can't stop me," Emma said, but her voice was uncertain. "Actually, I can." Mrs. Chun stepped forward, and as she did, Sarah could see through her, could see the truth of what she was. "I've been waiting for someone like them, someone who would choose to do the right thing, even when it cost them everything." The other spirits moved to flank Mrs. Chun, former tenants who had died peacefully in their beds, who had lived full lives and passed on naturally. Their combined presence seemed to push back against Emma's darkness. "You've been feeding on fear and selfishness for too long," Mrs. Chun continued. "But Sarah and David have shown something different. They've shown love, sacrifice, the willingness to put others before themselves." Emma backed away, suddenly looking like the frightened child she truly was. "I just wanted friends. I just didn't want to be alone." "I know, sweetheart." Mrs. Chun's voice became gentle. "But this isn't the way. You've been hurting people, trapping souls that should have been free to move on. But if they leave, I'll be all alone again." "No," Mrs. Chun said, extending her hand. "You won't be alone. We'll be here, all of us who died peacefully in this place. We'll be your family, your friends. But you have to let the others go." Emma looked around at all the assembled spirits, then at Sarah and David. For the first time since they had met her, her black eyes showed something other than hunger. They showed hope. "Will you really stay with me?" she asked Mrs. Chun. "As long as you need us to," Mrs. Chun promised. Emma nodded slowly, then turned to Sarah and David. With a gesture that seemed to cost her tremendous effort, she severed the connection she had forged with them. Sarah gasped as life flooded back into her body, as colors became bright again and the world regained its weight and substance. Beside her, David collapsed to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," Emma said quietly. Then, to the other trapped souls, "You can go now. All of you, you're free." The apartment building across the courtyard began to glow with warm, natural light. In the windows, Sarah could see the Morrison family and all the others who had been trapped there. But now, instead of the empty, haunting stares they had worn as ghosts, their faces showed peace, relief, and gratitude. One by one, they began to fade, finally able to move on to whatever came next. The Morrison parents waved goodbye, a real wave this time, filled with warmth and appreciation. Little Emma stood with Mrs. Chun and the other peaceful spirits, watching her former prisoners find their freedom. "Is it over?" David asked, his voice hoarse from crying. Mrs. Chun, still translucent but somehow more solid than before, smiled at them. "For you, yes. Emma will stay here with us, learning to be at peace. The building will be safe now." Sarah looked at the elderly woman with new understanding. "How long have you been dead, Mrs. Chun?" 15 years, she replied with a sad smile. "I had a heart attack in my sleep, but I couldn't move on. Not while Emma was trapping innocent families. I stayed to try to warn people, to help where I could. Now, finally, I can rest." "What about the new couple?" David asked, remembering the pregnant woman they had seen through Emma's window. "Are they safe?" "They'll be fine," Mrs. Chun assured them. "The apartment is just an apartment now. No more ghosts, no more dangers. Just a home for the living." As the first light of dawn crept through their windows, Sarah and David found themselves truly alone in their apartment for the first time since they had moved in. The oppressive weight that had hung over them was gone. Replaced by a sense of peace they had forgotten was possible. "We should probably stay," Sarah said, looking around at their half-packed belongings. "This place needs people who will treat it with respect, who understand what happened here." David nodded. "And maybe we can help Mrs. Chun and Emma. Make sure no other families go through what we did." They spent the morning unpacking again, this time with lighter hearts. As Sarah arranged her books on the shelves, she found herself glancing toward the window across the courtyard, not with fear now, but with a strange sense of connection. In the third-floor window, she could just make out two figures, Mrs. Chun and Emma, standing side by side. Emma raised her hand in a small wave, not the predatory gesture of before, but the innocent greeting of a child who had finally found the family she had always needed. Sarah waved back. Over the following weeks, life in the building returned to a normalcy it hadn't known for decades. The new couple in 3B, Jake and Maria Santos, settled in without incident. Maria's pregnancy progressed smoothly, as she often spoke about how peaceful she felt in their new home. Other long-term tenants began to open up about their experiences over the years. Mr. Kowalski from 2A admitted he had seen strange things but had been too frightened to speak up. The young woman in 1C revealed she had moved in 6 months ago and had been planning to leave before the atmosphere suddenly improved. Sarah and David became unofficial historians of the building, collecting stories and making sure the memory of what had happened was preserved not as a source of fear, but as a reminder of the importance of compassion and sacrifice. Sometimes, late at night, they would still see Emma at her window. But now she was playing with other ghostly children, the spirits of kids who had died naturally over the years, drawn by the warmth and safety Mrs. Chun had created. They would play games, tell stories, and laugh together, finally experiencing the childhood that had been cut short for all of them. The building had become what Emma had always wanted, a place where no child was alone. 6 months later, as Sarah sat reading by her window on a quiet Sunday afternoon, she noticed a moving truck pulling up outside. A family with 2 young children was preparing to move into the apartment that had once been Emma's prison. For just a moment, Sarah felt a familiar chill of concern. But then she saw Emma appear at her window, not to threaten or hunt, but simply to watch with curious, finely living eyes as new neighbors arrived. The little boy from the moving family looked up at Emma's window and waved enthusiastically. Emma, after a moment's hesitation, waved back with genuine delight. It was just what it appeared to be, one child greeting another. Sarah smiled and returned to her book, secure in the knowledge that the building was finally at peace. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the new family settling in, of life continuing its eternal cycle of arrivals and departures, hellos and goodbyes. But this time, all the goodbyes would be natural ones. All the hellos would be filled with hope instead of hunger. The child at the window was still there, and probably always would be. But now, instead of watching for victims, Emma was simply doing what children do, watching the world with wonder, surrounded by love, no longer alone. And sometimes late at night, when the building was quiet and the world was still, if you listened very carefully, you could hear the sound of children playing, not with malice or hunger, but with the pure joy that every child deserves. The nightmare was over. The healing had begun.